In the pale, archival light of 1842, the name Gatlinburg was little more than a whisper in the throat of the Great Smoky Mountains. It was a place defined not by its ambitions, but by its boundaries. The most significant of these was not a fence or a river, but a line of sight. It was the point where the familiar, tamed earth of the settlement gave way to the untamed vertical wilderness of the ridge. And up there, in the mists that clung to the peaks like a shroud, lived the reason for that boundary. They called her the Mountain Witch, and her legend was the one law that terrified the state. If you find yourself drawn to the shadowed corners of history, where folklore bleeds into fact, then you have found your way to the right archive. Consider joining our circle so you do not miss the opening of the next forgotten case. Our story, or rather, our historical reconstruction, begins here, in this isolated pocket of the Appalachian frontier. To understand the events that would follow, one must first understand the atmosphere of the place itself. Gatlinburg was a community bound by necessity and geography. Its cabins were hewn from the very timber that hemmed them in, built with a rugged determination against a wilderness that was both provider and predator. The days were governed by the sun's arduous journey over the eastern peaks and its swift retreat behind the western ones, plunging the valley into a premature and profound darkness. The air itself was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the ever-present perfume of pine. Fog was a constant resident, rolling down the mountainside in silent, ghostly tides, blurring the edges of the world and muffling sound until the cry of a hawk or the distant ring of an axe felt like an intrusion. This was a place where the world felt ancient, and the works of man seemed temporary, an impudent footnote in a much older and larger story. The mountain was not merely a backdrop, it was an entity. It loomed over every birth, every death, every quiet moment of contemplation. Its shadow crept across the valley floor each afternoon, a physical reminder of its dominion. And it was from this looming presence that the legend was born. The story of the woman on the mountain was not a tale for frightening children on a cold night, but a fundamental tenet of survival, a piece of communal wisdom as essential as knowing which berries were poison and which streams would run dry. No one living in the town in the year of our account had ever claimed to have spoken with her. No one knew her name or where she had come from. She was simply a fact of their existence, a presence felt more than seen. The sightings were rare, fleeting, and always from a great distance, a curl of smoke seen rising from a place high on the ridge where no sane person would build a hearth. A solitary figure, silhouetted against the setting sun, standing motionlessly among the crags before melting back into the shadows of the forest. These glimpses served only to reinforce the mystery, to feed the quiet, respectful fear that governed the town's relationship with the heights above. The core of the legend, the rule that was passed down from parent to child in hushed, serious tones, was simple. You must never take from the mountain. It was a prohibition of absolute clarity. It did not mean one could not hunt its lower slopes for game or even fell trees for lumber, so long as one stayed within the understood, unspoken boundaries. But to ascend into her domain, into the high, fog-shrouded forests, and to take something that belonged there, that was a transgression of the highest order. It was not a matter of theft in the conventional sense. It was an act of imbalance. The legend stipulated that the mountain noticed every fallen leaf, every weathered stone, every plucked blossom, and the woman, its silent guardian, would know. The price for such an act was an exchange. The mountain would take something back, not something of equal material worth, but something of equal personal value, a tool, a pig, a memory, a child. The folklore was deliberately vague on the specifics, which only amplified the terror. The unknown nature of the retribution was a far more powerful deterrent than any clearly defined punishment. The children of Gatlinburg learned this lesson before they learned to properly read. A mother would grasp the small hand of her son as he reached for a strangely colored river stone at the edge of the woods, her voice low and firm. She would explain that the stone did not belong to him. It belonged to the forest, and the forest belonged to the mountain, and the mountain had a watcher. She would tell him that a pretty stone was not worth the empty chair at the dinner table, or the sudden sickness of the family's only milk cow. A father would admonish his daughter for picking a wildflower that grew just beyond the edge of their cleared land, reminding her that its beauty was part of the mountain's balance, and that to disturb it was to invite a disturbance into their own home. These were not idle threats. They were articles of faith, rooted in a history of unexplained misfortunes that had, over generations, been meticulously cataloged and attributed to this one singular cause. A blight that destroyed a season's crops was remembered to have followed a farmer's decision to haul down a unique, gnarled log for his mantelpiece. A sudden fever that claimed a young boy was spoken of in connection to the beautiful hawk feather he had found and hidden in his room only days before. There was no formal record, no written chronicle of these events. There was only the powerful, pervasive, and unshakable oral history of the community, a living ledger of cause and effect that kept the townsfolk's eyes turned downward, away from the temptations of the high peaks. Into this carefully balanced world of fear and faith walked an outsider. In the late autumn of 1842, a man arrived in Gatlinburg who was a stranger to its customs and its ghosts. He was a traveler, a man whose profession kept him moving through the remote territories, documenting land claims or scouting for timber. He was a product of a different world, a world of maps and measurements, of logic and skepticism. He saw the great mountain not as a living, watchful entity, but as a geological formation, a collection of timber, rock, and soil to be assessed and exploited. He was not a malevolent man, merely a modern one, and his mind had no room for the ancient superstitions of a secluded mountain town. We have a single, humanizing detail of him, passed down through the town's memory. In the evenings, at the small public house that served as the settlement center, he would pull from his coat a small tarnished silver locket. Inside, according to the innkeeper who saw it once, was a miniature portrait of a handsome woman with kind eyes. He would look at it for a long time before closing it with a soft click, a quiet, personal ritual that seemed strangely at odds with his otherwise boisterous and confident demeanor. This small, private gesture is the only evidence that he was a man with something precious to lose. He heard the whispers about the mountain which, of course, it was impossible not to. He would see conversations cease when he approached a group of men gathered by the blacksmith's forge. He would notice the way a mother pulled her children closer if he mentioned his intent to survey the higher elevations. He took this not as a warning, but as a challenge, a sign of the locals' backwardness. He asked questions, but received only guarded, unhelpful replies. The men would say only that it was a hard climb, and that there was nothing up there worth the effort. The women would simply shake their heads and turn away, their faces set in grim disapproval. In the tavern one evening, warmed by whiskey and his own sense of superiority, he declared his intention to ascend the main ridge the following day. A heavy silence fell over the room. An old man, a hunter who had spent his entire life on the fringes of the great forest, finally spoke. His voice was raspy, weathered like old leather. He told the traveler that some things are best left undisturbed. He advised him that the mountain did not welcome visitors. The traveler laughed, a loud, booming sound that was an affront to the tavern's quiet solemnity. He replied that he was not a visitor, but a surveyor, and that his work required him to go where he pleased. He told them he was not afraid of old wives' tales and local spooks. The silence that followed his declaration was deeper and colder than before. The next morning, the traveler set out as promised. The day was overcast, the sky a uniform sheet of gray that promised a slow, persistent drizzle. The air was cool and damp. He was a strong man, and the initial part of the climb was easy enough, following a well-worn game trail through the dense lower forests. But as he climbed higher, the character of the woods began to change. The trail vanished, forcing him to push his way through tangled undergrowth and over moss-slicked boulders. The familiar sounds of the forest, the chatter of squirrels and the songs of birds, gradually faded away, replaced by an unnerving stillness. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the snap of twigs under his boots. A thick fog, which had been lurking among the higher peaks, began to descend, weaving its way through the trees in dense, white tendrils. It swallowed the world behind him, erasing the valley and the town, leaving him isolated in a small, shrinking circle of visibility. The trees here were different. They were older, larger, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes, their bark covered in a pale, sickly-looking lichen. He began to notice other anomalies, small details that his rational mind struggled to dismiss. Strange piles of stones, arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural. Symbols, like primitive eyes, scratched into the bark of ancient trees, all facing downhill, as if to watch anyone who approached. It was in the heart of this strange, silent wood that he found the cabin. It was almost perfectly hidden, nestled in a small, unnaturally level clearing. It was old, ancient even, the logs darkened by centuries of mountain weather, the roof sagging under the weight of a thick blanket of moss. It seemed less like a structure that had been built, and more like one that had grown from the earth itself. A single, dark window, like a vacant eye, stared out into the fog. The door hung slightly ajar, a dark, unwelcoming slash in the gray wood. A strange curiosity, stronger than his unease, compelled him forward. He pushed the door open. It swung inward without a sound. The air inside was cold and musty, thick with the smell of dust, decay, and something else, something vaguely metallic and unpleasant. The light from the doorway did little to penetrate the gloom. As his eyes adjusted, he saw that the cabin was not entirely empty. A crude table and a single chair stood in the center of the small room. In the corner was a pile of what looked like furs, long since rotted away to little more than dust and hair, and on a narrow mantelpiece above a cold, stone hearth sat a single object. It was a small bird, carved from a piece of dark, polished wood. The craftsmanship was exquisite, almost impossibly so. Every feather was rendered in minute detail, the head cocked in a disturbingly lifelike pose, the tiny eyes seeming to gleam in the dim light. It was a beautiful, delicate thing to find in such a place of profound decay. The traveler felt a sudden, powerful urge to possess it. He told himself it was a relic, a piece of local history. He reasoned that it was abandoned, that its owner was long dead, that it was simply rotting away here, unseen. He stepped forward, his boots stirring up clouds of dust from the floorboards. He reached out and took the carving. It was smooth and cool to the touch, heavier than it looked. As his fingers closed around it, a floorboard creaked somewhere in the shadows behind him. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. There was nothing there, only the oppressive darkness and the profound silence. He dismissed it as the settling of the old structure, a trick of the nerves. But the feeling of being watched, a feeling that had been a faint prickle on his neck during the climb, was now an intense, undeniable certainty. He felt unseen eyes upon him from the cabin's deepest shadows. He quickly pocketed the wooden bird and backed out of the cabin, not turning his back on the dark interior until he was once again outside in the gray, foggy air. He did not linger. The woods that had seemed merely unsettling on the way up now felt actively menacing. He hurried his descent, stumbling on hidden roots and slippery stones, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by a primal need to return to the world of men. He felt a desperate urge to look back, to see if he was being followed, but he resisted it, afraid of what he might see. Finally, as he neared the edge of the clearing that marked the town's boundary, he risked a single glance back up the mountain, and he saw her. High above, on a distant rocky outcrop, a figure stood. It was too far to make out any features, but it was unmistakably the silhouette of a person, wrapped in what looked like dark shawls. The figure was perfectly still, a lone, vertical shape against the swirling gray mist. It was simply standing there, watching him. A cold, visceral fear, unlike anything he had ever known, seized him. It was a fear that bypassed his rational mind entirely, a deep, instinctual terror. He knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that the figure was the witch, and that she had seen his transgression. He turned and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, not stopping until he burst out of the tree line and saw the familiar, reassuring shapes of the town's cabins ahead. That evening, back in the relative safety of the tavern, he tried to recapture his earlier bravado. He pulled the carved bird from his pocket and slammed it down on the bar for all to see. He boasted of his climb, of the abandoned cabin, of the trinket he had claimed as his prize. He did not mention the figure on the ridge. As he spoke, a pall fell over the room. The few patrons and the innkeeper stared at the wooden bird, their faces a mixture of horror and awe. The old hunter who had warned him the night before slowly shook his head, his expression one of profound pity. He told the traveler, his voice barely a whisper, that he had made a terrible mistake. He said that a debt had now been incurred and that the mountain would come to collect. The traveler, though shaken by the reaction, forced a laugh. He called them a pack of superstitious fools, picked up his prize, and retired to the simple room he had rented for the night. He placed the exquisitely carved bird on the small table beside his bed, its polished eyes seeming to watch him in the flickering candlelight. Outside, the fog rolled in from the mountain, thicker and more suffocating than ever before, wrapping the town of Gatlinburg in a silent, white embrace. The traveler blew out his candle and lay down to sleep, wholly unaware that the simple act of taking a forgotten object had sealed his fate, and that the first disappearance was now only a matter of hours away. The dawn that broke over Gatlinburg the following morning was one of deceptive tranquility. The thick fog of the previous night had receded, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening with moisture. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the lingering tendrils of mist in the valley, catching the dewdrops on pine needles and turning them into a million tiny, cold diamonds. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and the distant, reassuring aroma of the baker's hearth being kindled. It was a morning like any other, a morning that promised the familiar rhythms of life in a small, isolated town. But a profound wrongness had already taken root in the silence, a dissonant note in the day's quiet symphony. It was an absence, a void waiting to be discovered. The first to sense it was the innkeeper. A man of routine and meticulous habit, he began his day, as he always did, with the stoking of the tavern's main fire. Yet as he worked, a subtle unease pricked at him. The traveler, a man whose boisterous presence had dominated the small establishment, was uncharacteristically silent. There was no sound from the rented room upstairs, no heavy footfalls, no coughing or clearing of the throat to signal the start of a new day. Attributing the quiet to a deep sleep brought on by whiskey, the innkeeper continued his tasks. He swept the floors, wiped down the rough-hewn tables, and prepared for the handful of early risers who would seek a warm drink before heading to their labors. But as the sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the valley floor, the silence from the traveler's room grew from a curiosity into a concern. By mid-morning, it had become a heavy, pressing thing. The innkeeper, a man not given to flights of fancy, finally set aside his work. He climbed the narrow, creaking staircase, his steps echoing in the quiet building. He called out the traveler's name, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. There was no reply. He called again, louder this time, his knuckles rapping against the thick plank of the door. The only response was the deep, resonant silence of an empty space. With a growing sense of dread, he pushed on the door. It was not locked. It swung inward on protesting hinges, revealing the scene within. The room was cold. It was a deep, penetrating cold that spoke not of a chilly morning, but of a long-abandoned space. The hearth was a black, desolate square, filled with pale gray ash that looked as if it had been dead for days, not hours. A faint, cloying scent of damp soil and decaying leaves hung in the air, an odor that had no place within the walls of a human dwelling. The bed was in a state of disarray, the blankets and quilt thrown back as if the occupant had left in a sudden hurry, but the traveler was not there. His boots were gone, as was his heavy coat. His satchel, however, remained on the floor by the bed, its leather straps unbuckled. The entire scene was a portrait of contradiction, a hasty departure, yet a valuable possession left behind. The innkeeper's gaze swept the room, cataloging the small, disturbing details. The window was shut and barred from the inside. The door, though unlocked, had shown no signs of forced entry. It was as if the man had simply vanished into the cold, still air. And then the innkeeper saw it. On the small, crude table next to the bed, where the traveler had placed his prize the night before, sat the carved wooden bird. It was the only object in the room that seemed to be the focus of any attention. It rested in the center of the table, a single, dark point in the gray morning light. But it was not as he had last seen it. The bird, and the table around it, was soiled. A small, wet pile of dark, loamy earth was smeared across the polished wood, clinging to the bird's delicate feathers and pooling in a dark ring at its base. It was mountain mud. The innkeeper recognized it instantly. It was the rich, black soil from the highest elevations, a substance distinct from the clay and rock of the valley floor. It was as if a piece of the remote, forbidden wilderness had been deliberately brought into this room and placed upon the table as a sign, a message. The innkeeper backed away slowly, a cold knot of fear tightening in his stomach. He did not touch the bird. He did not touch anything. He turned and fled down the stairs, his mind reeling with the whispers of the night before, with the old hunter's grave warning. A debt had been incurred, and it appeared the mountain had, indeed, come to collect. The arrival of Sheriff Amos Weller was, for the townspeople, a brief and welcome return to the world of reason and order. The sheriff was a man whose entire being seemed to stand in opposition to the nebulous fears that haunted the community. He was not a native of Gatlinburg, having been appointed to the post some years prior by the state authority. He was a tall, stern man, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from the same unyielding granite as the mountains themselves. His movements were deliberate, economical, and precise. There was a single, humanizing detail about him that the townsfolk had noted. Before entering any building to conduct his official business, he would pause for a moment and produce a small cloth from his coat pocket, with which he would give his silver sheriff star a brief, vigorous polish. It was a small ritual, a quiet affirmation of his faith in the law he represented, a tangible symbol of order in a world that often felt chaotic and untamed. He was a man who believed in facts, in evidence, and in the logical progression from cause to effect. He did not believe in curses, witches, or legends of the night. When the breathless innkeeper brought him the news of the traveler's disappearance, Sheriff Weller listened with a patient, impassive expression, his mind already sifting through the panicked account for the hard, verifiable details. He entered the traveler's room with the calm, methodical air of a surgeon entering an operating theater. He observed the cold hearth, the unmade bed, the satchel on the floor. He noted the barred window and the unlocked door. His investigation was a quiet, focused affair. He moved through the room with a practiced eye, his gaze lingering on the details that mattered, dismissing those that did not. He was building a rational explanation in his mind. The man had likely had too much to drink, had woken in the night, and had wandered off, perhaps becoming lost in the fog. It was a common enough tragedy in this part of the country. But then he saw the table, and the wooden bird, and the mud, and for the first time that morning, the sheriff's carefully constructed composure showed a crack. He leaned in closer, his keen eyes examining the strange tableau. The mud was, as the innkeeper had described, not from the town. It was dark, almost black, and flecked with tiny fragments of mica and decayed vegetation that he knew could only be found at much higher altitudes. It was wet, impossibly so, as if it had been scooped from a damp, sunless forest floor only moments ago, not carried down a mountain and through a town the previous day. He walked to the door of the room, then out to the top of the stairs, his eyes scanning the floorboards. There were no muddy footprints leading into the room. There were no tracks leading out. It was a physical impossibility. The mud was here, a clear and undeniable piece of evidence, yet there was no evidence of how it had arrived. It was the first detail that did not fit his logical framework, the first gear that refused to turn in the clockwork of his investigation. He returned to the table and, using the tip of his knife, gently scraped a small sample of the mud onto a piece of paper, folding it carefully and placing it in his pocket. He then picked up the wooden bird. It was, he had to admit, a remarkable piece of work. The artistry was stunning, but as he held it, he felt an inexplicable sense of revulsion. It felt cold, unnaturally cold, a deep, cellular cold that seemed to suck the warmth from his fingers. He had the distinct and unsettling impression that the object was not merely a carving, but something more, something that was aware of his touch. He quickly placed it back on the table, the small sound of wood on wood echoing in the silent room. A question began to form in his mind, a question he would have dismissed as absurd only an hour earlier. Was this object the reason for the man's disappearance? The core of his rational mind rejected the notion, but the cold, hard evidence on the table before him offered no other explanation. His investigation moved outside, into the gray morning light. The sheriff began a systematic search of the area around the inn, and it was there, in the soft, damp earth behind the building, that he found the second piece of impossible evidence: footprints. They led from the direction of the inn's back door, heading in a straight, unwavering line toward the base of the mountain. But they were not the tracks of the traveler. They were not, in fact, the tracks of any man or beast he had ever seen. The prints were long and narrow, like those of a barefoot human, yet they possessed a strangeness that defied easy description. The impressions were deepest at the toe and the ball of the foot, suggesting a forward-leaning, predatory gait. There was no discernible arch, and where the heel should have been, the print was shallow, almost non-existent. Most disturbing of all was the stride. The distance between each print was enormous, far longer than any man could achieve, even at a full run. It was a gait that spoke of unnatural height and an effortless, loping speed. Sheriff Weller stared at the tracks, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew to be possible. He followed them for 100 yards, his own boot prints falling comically short of the strange, elongated stride he was tracking. The path was unerring. It did not deviate or meander. It cut a straight and purposeful line through the undergrowth, directly toward the looming, fog-shrouded ridge. It was at this point that a new figure joined the unfolding drama. An old man, known to the town only as the mountain guide, emerged from the edge of the woods. He was a relic from an older time, a man whose face was a road map of wrinkles, whose eyes held the deep, quiet wisdom of one who has spent a lifetime listening to the language of the wilderness. He did not offer a greeting to the sheriff. He simply walked to the line of strange tracks and looked down, his expression unchanging. After a long moment of silence, he spoke, his voice the dry rustle of autumn leaves. He told the sheriff that he was wasting his time. He said the tracks would continue to the place where the trees grew thick and the fog never lifted, and there they would vanish. He warned the sheriff, in a tone that was not threatening but was instead filled with a profound and ancient weariness, to stop looking. He explained that what the traveler had done was an old and foolish thing, and that the consequences were as predictable as the turning of the seasons. He pointed a gnarled finger toward the high peaks. He said the traveler was no longer lost. He was taken. He was part of the mountain now, a price that had been paid for a debt that had been incurred. He told the sheriff that to follow these tracks was to announce oneself as the next debtor, that to climb the mountain in search of the lost was to offer oneself up for exchange. Sheriff Amos Weller, a man of the law, a man of undisputed authority in the valley, found himself in an impossible position. Before him was a line of tracks that defied explanation. Beside him was an old man, a living embodiment of the town's deepest fears, speaking of debts and exchanges as if they were articles of law. And behind him, the town of Gatlinburg was stirring, the news of the traveler's disappearance spreading like a contagion. Fear, once a quiet and private superstition, was now becoming a public hysteria. The question was no longer simply what had happened to the traveler. The question, now laid bare in the form of impossible footprints and a chilling warning, was whether the witch's curse was real. For the townspeople, the answer was already clear. They saw the events of the morning not as a mystery to be solved, but as a prophecy being fulfilled. But for Sheriff Weller, the law demanded action. A man was missing. An investigation had to be conducted. Despite the guide's solemn warning, despite the cold dread that was beginning to seep into his own rational mind, he knew what he had to do. He could not allow fear and folklore to govern his duty. He turned away from the strange tracks and the old guide, his face set like stone. He declared that he was forming a search party, and that they would ascend the mountain at first light the next day. He would find the traveler, or he would find a rational explanation for his disappearance. It was a decision born of duty and disbelief, a defiant stand against the encroaching tide of superstition. It was also a tragic, fatal miscalculation, for in ordering the ascent, he was not just challenging a local legend. He was trespassing on a law far older than his own, and leading a party of men directly into the heart of a place that did not distinguish between the guilty and the curious. They would not find the traveler. They would only find that the mountain remembers every trespass, and that it had been waiting for them. The decision, once made, settled over Sheriff Amos Weller with the cold, unyielding weight of a final judgment. He would not be governed by folklore. He would not allow his authority, and by extension the authority of the state and the entire apparatus of rational human law, to be cowed by the ghost stories of a secluded mountain community. And so, a search party was formed. It was a small, grim assembly that gathered in the pre-dawn chill, their forms wreathed in the steam of their own breath. There was the sheriff himself, his face a mask of grim determination as he performed his small, private ritual of polishing his star, a defiant gesture against the encroaching shadows. There was Luther Pike, the old mountain guide, who had agreed to lead them only after the sheriff had made it a matter of official compulsion. The guide stood apart from the others, his silence a heavy, unspoken rebuke. His presence was both a necessity and a terrible omen. The party was filled out by a handful of the town's sturdiest men. The blacksmith, a man of formidable physical strength whose confidence seemed to have dwindled in the face of this new, intangible threat. The sheriff's own young deputy, his loyalty to his superior warring with the deep-seated fears of his upbringing, and two younger farmers, their faces pale with a mixture of morbid curiosity and profound, youthful terror. They were armed with rifles, lanterns, and coils of rope, the tools of men preparing to face a physical adversary, a bear or a catamount, not a legend. The ascent began in silence. The first hour of the climb was through familiar territory, the lower slopes of the great mountain. Here, the forest was alive, a vibrant tapestry of sound and life. The air was filled with the chattering of squirrels and the fluting calls of morning birds. The path, though steep, was well defined, a game trail that was a known quantity to the men of Gatlinburg. Sunlight, thin and golden, slanted through the canopy, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. There was a semblance of normality to this part of the journey, a brief, deceptive period in which the men could almost believe that this was just another difficult day's work. Sheriff Weller pushed them onward, setting a hard, relentless pace, as if he could outmarch the fear that followed them. But as they climbed higher, the world began to change. The transition was not gradual, but jarringly abrupt. They crossed an unseen threshold and stepped into a different reality. One moment they were in a living forest, the next they were in a place of profound and unnatural death. These were the dead patches, zones of botanical blight that the townsfolk had always spoken of in hushed tones. The vibrant green of the lower slopes gave way to a stark landscape of gray and black. The trees here were skeletal, their bare branches clawing at the sky like the hands of the dying. Their bark was not rotted, but petrified, hard and cold to the touch, and covered in a leprous, white fungus. There was no undergrowth, no ferns or bushes, only a thick carpet of blackened, desiccated leaves that crumbled to dust under their boots. The very air grew colder, and a deep, oppressive silence descended. There were no birds here, no insects. The silence was not merely an absence of sound, but a palpable presence, a heavy blanket that smothered all noise. One of the young farmers stumbled, his cry of alarm seeming to be swallowed by the dead air before it had fully left his lips. Sheriff Weller, ever the rationalist, attempted to find a logical cause. He spoke of lightning strikes, of a localized plant disease, of a fire that had burned through years ago, but his words rang hollow, even to himself. The edges of the dead zone were too sharp, the line between life and death too clearly delineated to be the work of nature, and there was no smell of smoke, only the cold, sterile scent of damp rock and decay. It was in the heart of one of these silent, gray clearings that they found the first signs of those who had come before. They discovered the remnants of an old campsite, or rather, a series of them, layered on top of one another like geological strata. A rusted tin cup here, a rotted leather strap there, the charcoal remains of a fire pit that looked decades old. Luther Pike, the guide, simply glanced at the detritus and kept moving, his expression unchanging. It was the sheriff who paused, examining the site with a forensic eye. He realized that these were not the camps of hunters or trappers. They were the desperate, temporary shelters of searchers, people who, like them, had climbed the mountain in pursuit of someone who had vanished. The discovery did not bring comfort. Instead, it added a new layer of historical weight to their dread. It suggested that their current endeavor was not a unique event, but a recurring tragedy, a ritualistic pilgrimage of loss that had been playing out on these slopes for generations. They were not pioneers in this foolish quest. They were merely the latest in a long, doomed procession. The second anomaly, when it came, was far more personal and far more terrifying. They had pushed on, leaving the dead zone behind and entering a region of the forest that was, if anything, even more unsettling. The trees here were alive, but they were monstrously old and twisted, their trunks gnarled into agonizing shapes, their branches interwoven into a dense, light-blocking canopy that plunged the world into a perpetual twilight. It was the blacksmith who found it. He had stopped to catch his breath, leaning against the mossy trunk of an ancient oak, when his hand brushed against something small and hard, wedged into a crevice in the bark. He worked it free and held it in his palm. It was a small, crudely carved charm, fashioned from a piece of pale, smooth wood, perhaps birch. It was a simple whittling of a human figure, no bigger than his thumb. But what made the blacksmith's blood run cold were the 3 letters burned into its surface. They were his own family's initials. He stared at the object, his face draining of all color. He was a 3rd-generation resident of the valley. His father and his grandfather had been the town's blacksmiths before him. He knew his family's history with an unshakable certainty, and he knew, with that same certainty, that no one in his family had ever ventured this high onto the mountain. It was a violation of the town's most sacred taboo. His father had been a man of deep, abiding superstition, and his grandfather had been the one to tell him the stories of the witch in the first place. The sheriff took the charm from the blacksmith's trembling hand. He examined it closely. The carving was primitive, yet strangely evocative. The wood was old, weathered smooth by time and exposure. The burned initials were faded, but unmistakable. He asked the blacksmith if he was certain, if there was any possibility that a distant relative, a forgotten uncle or cousin, might have made this. The blacksmith shook his head, his eyes wide with a dawning, superstitious horror. He said his family had never taken from the mountain. They had always obeyed the rule. The sheriff fell silent. Here was another piece of evidence that refused to fit into his world. It was an artifact that should not exist. It was a temporal impossibility, a message from a past that had never happened. He could not log it, or categorize it, or explain it away. It was a direct, personal communication from the entity they were hunting, a sign that it knew them, that it knew their families, their histories. The charm suggested that their presence here was not a surprise, but an inevitability, that they were not merely trespassing, but fulfilling a destiny that had been carved into wood long ago. He slipped the impossible object into his pocket, the smooth wood feeling unnervingly warm against his skin. As if summoned by this new level of fear, the fog descended. It did not roll in from the peaks. It seemed to materialize from the air around them, coalescing from the damp chill that clung to the ancient trees. It was a fog of supernatural thickness, a roiling, white entity that swallowed the world in seconds. Visibility was reduced to a few feet. The men became isolated figures, ghostly silhouettes in the swirling whiteness. The forest, which had been merely unsettling, now became a claustrophobic, bewildering labyrinth. The fog distorted all sound, muffling their footsteps and making their voices seem thin and distant. It played tricks on the eyes, turning a twisted branch into a reaching arm, a shadowed rock into a crouching figure. A profound sense of disorientation took hold. They were adrift in a sea of white, their only anchor the grim, silent form of Luther Pike, who seemed to navigate the featureless landscape by some internal, unerring compass. The air grew heavy and carried with it a strange, static charge, making the hairs on their arms and the back of their necks stand on end. And then the whispers began. At first, it was barely perceptible, a faint, sibilant sound on the very edge of hearing, easily dismissed as the sighing of the wind or the rustle of a leaf. The young deputy was the first to react. He stopped dead, his head cocked, and asked the others if they had heard that. The sheriff, his voice tight with forced composure, told him it was nothing and to keep moving. But then one of the farmers froze, his face a mask of disbelief. He swore he had heard his own name, whispered directly into his ear. The men drew closer together, their rifles held tight, their eyes darting into the impenetrable wall of white that surrounded them. The whispering grew more distinct, weaving in and out of the oppressive silence. It was not a single voice, but many, and yet they all seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, and they were personal. Each man heard something meant only for him. One heard his wife calling him home to supper. Another heard his mother, long dead, singing a lullaby from his childhood. The blacksmith heard the rhythmic clang of a hammer on an anvil, a sound that should have been a comfort, but in this place was a terrifying mockery of his life's work. This was the true nature of the mountain's power. It was not an external threat to be fought with guns and knives. It was an internal, psychological assault. It sought out the deepest corners of their minds, weaponizing their memories, their loves, and their fears against them. The search party, which had begun the day as a cohesive unit, was now fracturing, each man retreating into his own private, terrifying hallucination. Panic was beginning to set in, a cold, creeping tide that threatened to overwhelm them. Even Sheriff Amos Weller, the staunch bastion of logic and order, was not immune. Amidst the cacophony of phantom sounds, he heard a single, clear voice. It was a calm, dispassionate female voice, and it spoke his full name, Amos Weller, with a chilling, archival precision. The sound shattered the final remnants of his skepticism. Logic had no defense against a foe that knew his name. Fear, raw and primal, finally took hold of him. He now understood the guide's warning. They were not hunting a person. They were being stalked by a presence, an ancient, intelligent consciousness that had watched them, known them, and anticipated them long before they had ever set foot on its slopes. It was through this maelstrom of psychological terror and blinding fog that they stumbled forward, driven by a desperate, instinctual need to find shelter, to find a place of light and seeming sanity in the heart of the madness. And then, as if the mountain had decided the time for games was over, a shape resolved itself out of the mist ahead. It was a dark, angular form, a solid slash of black against the swirling gray. It was the cabin. It looked abandoned, ancient, and yet, from its crude stone chimney, a thin, pale tendril of smoke was rising, a silent, impossible invitation into the heart of the mystery. The cabin was not a sanctuary. It was a destination. The men, fractured by the psychological assault of the whispers and adrift in the disorienting sea of white fog, did not choose to approach it so much as they were herded toward it. The thin ribbon of smoke rising from its chimney was not a promise of warmth, but a beacon, drawing them toward the heart of the very thing they had come to confront. As they drew nearer, emerging from the swirling mist, the structure's true nature revealed itself. It was ancient, a grotesque fusion of human effort and the slow, relentless will of the wilderness. The logs were the color of bone, weathered by countless seasons of ice and sun, their surfaces covered in a thick, velvety carpet of moss that seemed to pulse with a damp, unhealthy life. The roof, a sagging spine of rotting timbers, was more moss than wood. The entire cabin seemed to be sinking back into the earth from which its materials had been taken, a slow, inevitable surrender. A single window, a small, square void, was glazed with a film of grime so thick it was nearly opaque, giving it the appearance of a cataracted eye. The door, a slab of rough-hewn timber, hung slightly ajar, a dark, vertical wound in the cabin's side, beckoning them into the shadows within. There was no discussion, there was no plan. The formal structure of the search party, the hierarchy of sheriff and deputy and guide, had dissolved in the face of the supernatural. They were just 5 terrified men, their authority and their reason stripped away, leaving only the raw, animal instinct to escape the menacing, whispering fog. Sheriff Amos Weller, his face pale and set, moved forward as if in a trance. His duty, the very core of his identity, compelled him to see this through, to find a tangible truth, however monstrous, at the center of the nightmare. He placed a hand on the cold, damp wood of the door and pushed. It swung inward with a low, guttural groan, the sound of a tomb being opened for the first time in a century. The air that billowed out was not the warm, smoky air of a tended fire, but a wave of profound, sepulchral cold. It carried the smell of old dust, of stone that had never known the sun, and a faint, sharp, metallic scent like old blood or fresh ozone. One by one, the men crossed the threshold, huddling together just inside the doorway, their rifles held uselessly before them, their eyes struggling to adjust to the oppressive gloom. The interior was a single, small room, a box of shadows. The source of the smoke seen from outside was a mystery, for the hearth before them was a gaping, black mouth, filled with nothing but pale, ancient ash. The cold that emanated from it seemed to be the source of the room's chill, a deliberate and active cold that leached the warmth from their bodies. The light was a meager, spectral thing, filtering through the single filthy window and illuminating a hazy column of dust motes dancing in the still air. The room was unnervingly sparse. A single, rickety chair stood as if in attendance to a crude, heavy table that dominated the center of the floor. The floorboards were bare, worn smooth by the passage of years, and in the corners, shadows clung with a thick, physical presence, as if they were woven from cobwebs and despair. It was a place of profound and desolate emptiness, yet the feeling of being watched was more intense here than it had been even in the fog. It was a silent, knowing, and utterly patient observation. On the surface of the table, free from the thick layer of dust that coated everything else, sat a single object. It was a book. It was a large, heavy-looking volume, bound in dark leather, that was cracked and peeling with age. It had no title, no markings of any kind on its cover. It simply lay there, a silent, final statement in the center of the desolate room. Sheriff Weller, moving with the stiff, automaton-like gait of a man being compelled against his will, approached the table. The others remained by the door, a tight knot of fear, watching him. He reached out a trembling hand and laid it on the leather cover. It was cold to the touch, with the deep, lifeless cold of a gravestone. He took a steadying breath, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence, and opened the ledger. The pages were a pale, sickly yellow, brittle and thin as dried skin, but the script that covered them was a thing of shocking, impossible clarity. It was an elegant, flowing cursive, written with a steady hand in a black ink that seemed to possess its own dark light. And as the sheriff's eyes scanned the first page, a low sound escaped his throat, a noise of dawning, catastrophic comprehension. He began to read aloud, his voice a hoarse, unsteady whisper, that seemed an unforgivable intrusion into the cabin's sacred silence. The book was a ledger, not of debts or accounts, but of names. The names of the people of Gatlinburg. He read the first few entries, his voice gaining a strange, rhythmic, incantatory quality. He read the name of the town's first preacher, a man dead for 60 years. Beside the name was a date, and a small, precise annotation. A single, perfect hawk's feather. He read the name of the blacksmith's great-grandmother. Beside it, another date, and the words, 3 white stones from the upper creek. The men by the door listened, their faces contorting in a slow, dawning horror. These were not just names. These were their histories, their ancestors. They were the names from the family Bibles, the names carved into the weathered headstones in the churchyard. And beside each name was the record of a transgression, a small theft from the mountain, followed by a date that corresponded, they all knew with a chilling, instinctual certainty, to some forgotten family tragedy, a sudden illness, a stillbirth, a barn fire. The book was a secret and terrible history of their town, a meticulous accounting of every crime and every subsequent punishment. It was the folklore made flesh, the legend rendered in inescapable, archival detail. The unspoken fears that had governed their lives were now laid bare, a written record of a covenant they had not even known they were a part of. Sheriff Weller's hands shook as he turned the fragile pages, the dry rasp of paper the only sound. He moved through the generations, past the names of the dead, and into the names of the living. He read the name of the baker's wife, her crime listed as a handful of wild berries picked too high on the slope only the spring before. The men remembered the wasting sickness that had taken her youngest child a week later. The myth was merging with history before their eyes, the supernatural bleeding into the mundane until they were indistinguishable. Then, Weller's finger stopped. He had reached the final entries. The ink here was darker, fresher, and he found the name he had been searching for, the name of the traveler. The entry was stark and simple. The man's name, the date of his arrival, and the damning, final annotation, a carved wooden bird. The words hung in the cold air, a verdict and a sentence. Here was the proof. Here was the cold, irrefutable evidence that his entire worldview, his entire faith in a rational, ordered universe, was a lie. The legend was real. The curse was a matter of meticulous, historical record. It was in that moment of terrible, world-shattering revelation that the storm broke. It did not begin with a distant rumble, but with an instantaneous, violent explosion of sound and light. A flash of lightning, so close and so brilliant, illuminated the cabin's interior in a single, stark, blue-white frame, burning the image of the men's terrified faces onto the darkness like a photographic plate. The clap of thunder that followed was not a roll, but a physical concussion, a solid blow that shook the small cabin to its very foundations. The floorboards trembled, and dust rained down from the ancient timbers of the ceiling, and then came the rain. It was a torrential, biblical deluge, a solid wall of water that hammered against the roof with the deafening roar of 1,000 drums. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful, and distinctly predatory sound, shrieking through the cracks in the cabin's walls. The fragile sanctuary had become a cage, a trembling, resonant box in the heart of the storm's fury. The men were paralyzed, their previous fear now magnified into a state of pure animal terror. The deputy began to pray, his words a frantic, incoherent babble. The blacksmith gripped his rifle so tightly his knuckles were white, the weapon utterly useless against the elemental chaos that had been unleashed. Through the single, grime-streaked window, they could see the world outside only in the brief, strobing flashes of lightning, and in those flashes, they saw figures. They were fleeting, indistinct shapes, moving through the driving rain just at the edge of the clearing. They were too tall, too thin, their movements too fluid to be human. They seemed to be made of shadow and rain, spectral sentinels drawn by the storm, gathering to bear witness. One of the young farmers, his mind finally snapping under the accumulated weight of the whispers, the ledger, and the storm, let out a high, piercing shriek. He backed away from the others, his eyes fixed on the window, his face a mask of utter madness. Another bolt of lightning struck, this one hitting the ridge just outside the cabin with a deafening, sizzling crack. The flash was absolute, a blast of pure white that rendered them all momentarily blind. The thunderclap was so immediate and so powerful that it felt as if the cabin itself had been struck. The single, flickering candle on the table, their only source of light, was snuffed out by the percussive force, plunging the room into absolute, suffocating darkness. The blackness was total, disorienting. It was filled with the sound of the raging storm, the blacksmith's ragged breathing, the deputy's desperate prayers, and the terrified, whimpering sobs of the second farmer. And then, a new sound, the creak of the cabin door being thrown open, followed by a rush of wind and rain. The sheriff roared into the darkness, his voice cracking with a fear he no longer tried to conceal. He bellowed for one of the men to light the lantern. There was a frantic fumbling, the scrape of flint and steel. Once, twice, a spark caught. The wick of the lantern sputtered, then bloomed into a weak, sickly yellow light. The lantern's glow pushed back the shadows, revealing a scene of diminished terror. The sheriff, the deputy, the blacksmith, and the second farmer were all there, huddled near the table. Luther Pike, the guide, stood near the cold hearth, his expression as impassive and unreadable as ever. But the first farmer, the one who had been screaming at the window, was gone. The door was swinging wildly on its hinges, letting in sheets of wind-whipped rain that were already forming a dark pool on the floorboards. There had been no struggle, no cry for help beyond his initial shriek. He had been there in one flash of lightning, and gone by the next, vanished from a locked room of terrified men, as if he had been an illusion all along. As the remaining survivors stared at the open, empty doorway, their minds struggling to process the impossibility of what had just happened, Sheriff Weller's gaze was drawn back to the table, back to the open ledger. A new collective gasp of horror rose from the men. The book, which Weller had left open to the page with the traveler's name, now lay open to a new page, the final page. And on this page, in ink that was impossibly horribly fresh, so fresh that it glistened wetly in the lantern light, were their names. All of their names. The name of the farmer who had just vanished was there, already looking somehow faded, and below it, the names of the living, the second farmer, the deputy, the blacksmith, and last, his own name, Sheriff Amos Weller. The ledger was not just a historical record, it was a living document. It was a death warrant, and their sentences had just been written. The unseen writer of the ledger was the mountain itself, and in their act of trespass, they had just dictated its final terrible entry. The dawn that followed the storm was a thing of profound and terrible beauty. The tempest had scoured the world clean, and as a pale, bruised light began to seep into the sky, it revealed a landscape of devastation and unnatural stillness. The survivors in the cabin did not speak of what they had witnessed. Words had become meaningless artifacts of a world that no longer existed. The farmer who had vanished was not mourned. His absence was simply a fact, a new and terrible constant in their reality, like the cold or the darkness. There were now only 4 of them, plus the mountain guide, who had remained apart through the long, terrifying night, a silent, stoic observer of their unraveling. Their names had been written in the ledger. This knowledge had fundamentally altered them. They were no longer men, they were appointments, items on a supernatural schedule, their remaining hours ticking away according to a logic they could not comprehend. The journey down the mountain was the inversion of the ascent. Where before there had been a grim purpose, now there was only a hollow, instinctual flight. The forest was eerily quiet. The storm had passed, but the birds had not returned. There was no chatter of squirrels, no rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic dripping of water from the saturated leaves of the ancient trees, a sound like 1,000 weeping clocks marking their final moments. The ground was a treacherous mire of mud and slick, exposed roots, but they moved with a strange, heedless certainty, their bodies driven by a primal need to descend, to flee the suffocating presence of the heights. Luther Pike, the guide, led the way. He moved with the same unhurried, economical grace as before, but his silence now seemed less a product of weary wisdom and more the quiet of a ferryman guiding souls across a final dark river. He did not look back. He did not offer a hand or a word of encouragement. He was simply the instrument of their passage, leading them from one circle of hell to the next. Sheriff Amos Weller walked behind him, a ghost in his own life, the silver star pinned to his coat. Once the symbol of his unshakable faith in order and reason, now felt like a cruel joke, a meaningless trinket from a forgotten religion. The rational world he had inhabited, the world of laws and evidence and verifiable facts, had been systematically and brutally dismantled over the course of 24 hours. He was a lawman in a land where the only law was that of the mountain. He clutched the small, carved charm in his pocket, the one with the blacksmith's family initials. It felt warm, a small, constant reminder of the impossible truth he now carried. His mind was a maelstrom of terror and a strange, cold clarity. He understood, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the entity on the mountain was not just a local legend. It was a power, an ancient and territorial intelligence, and in their ignorance, they had provoked it into an act of terrifying, wide-scale retribution. The curse, he was beginning to suspect, had not ended with the traveler or with the lost member of their party. It had only just begun. Curses, he was realizing, do not simply spread outward like a contagion. They grow downward, like roots, poisoning the very soil from which a community has sprung. As they neared the base of the mountain, breaking through the final line of skeletal, blighted trees that seemed to stand as a permanent quarantine zone, the first signs of the town below came into view. And with that sight, the last vestiges of hope in Sheriff Weller's heart turned to ash. There was no smoke rising from the chimneys. In the cold, clean air of the morning after a storm, the sky above Gatlinburg should have been laced with dozens of plumes of white and gray smoke as hearths were rekindled against the damp chill. But the air was unnervingly clear. There was no distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer, no lowing of cattle, no barking of dogs. The town lay under a blanket of silence as profound and as absolute as the one they had just fled in the high, dead woods. It was a diorama of a town, a perfect, motionless replica from which all life had been stolen. They walked the last 100 yards to the edge of the settlement in a tight, frightened group. The air here was different. It was heavy, stagnant, and carried a strange metallic tang, and underneath it, the faint, sweet, cloying smell of death. And there was something else. A thin, gray dust seemed to be drifting through the air, catching the pale morning light. It was a fine, almost imperceptible ash, settling on their clothes and in their hair, though there was no sign of any fire. The first victims they found were the animals. The blacksmith's draft horses stood in their paddock, their great heads bowed as if in prayer, their bodies still warm but utterly lifeless. There were no marks on them, no signs of struggle or disease. They had simply ceased to be. A flock of chickens lay scattered in a dusty yard, like a handful of discarded feathery toys. A milk cow lay on its side in a field, its eyes open and staring with a placid indifference at the gray sky. The silence was the silence of the grave, a community-wide cessation of being. And then they saw the doors. Every door, on every cabin, on every outbuilding, stood open. Not forced open or broken down, but simply ajar, an invitation into the quiet horror within. It was a communal gesture of surrender. Sheriff Weller, moving now on the last fumes of his former authority, drew his pistol. The click of the hammer being pulled back, a shocking, violent intrusion into the stillness. He approached the first cabin, the home of a young family he knew well. He stepped across the threshold, the other men following close behind, their boots echoing on the wooden floor. The family was there. The husband was seated at his table, a half-carved piece of wood and a whittling knife in his hands. His wife sat in a rocking chair by the cold hearth, a basket of mending in her lap. Their two small children were on a rug on the floor, a wooden soldier fallen from their grasp. They were not dead, not in any way a physician would recognize. Their eyes were open. They were breathing, shallowly, almost imperceptibly, but they were gone. Their gazes were fixed on some middle distance, some internal landscape of absolute terror from which they could not, or would not, return. They were shells, human vessels from which the soul had been scooped clean, and on the mantelpiece, placed with the care of a collector arranging a prized specimen, was an object that did not belong. It was a bird's nest, perfectly intact, woven with strands of human hair, dark and gray, and nestled within it were three small, perfectly smooth, egg-shaped river stones. The sheriff stared at it, a cold, sickening understanding dawning in his mind. He backed out of the cabin and moved to the next, and the next. The scene was repeated with horrifying, meticulous precision. In every home, the occupants were present but absent, locked in a state of living death. And in every home, a new object had been placed in a position of prominence. In the preacher's house, a long, twisted piece of driftwood, shaped like a serpent, lay upon the open pages of the family Bible. The preacher's daughter, a girl of 16 known for her vibrant, defiant spirit, sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes, which had always been so full of life and mischief, now vacant, empty pools. In the home of the deputy, who was now weeping openly, a collection of unfamiliar, brightly colored fungi was arranged in a perfect circle on the kitchen table. The search party had become a procession of mourners, walking through the open mausoleum of their own town. The curse had been absolute. The mountain had not just taken the traveler in exchange for the carved bird. It had taken something from everyone, for their generations of fear, for their collective belief which had given the legend its power. The witch had come down from her perch and claimed them all. The objects in their homes were not trophies, they were invoices. They were receipts for souls collected, a quiet, terrifying statement of ownership. The town of Gatlinburg no longer belonged to its people. It was now an outlying territory of the mountain, a silent, curated museum of the witch's power. The question that had plagued the sheriff, the question of what happens when a legend no longer needs belief to exist, had been answered. It becomes a god, a hungry, possessive, and utterly implacable god. It was then, as the survivors stood in the center of the silent, dead town, that the bell began to toll. The sound came from the small, white church at the edge of the settlement. It was not a frantic, alarm-like ringing. It was a slow, deep, and measured tolling, the sound of a funeral dirge. One beat, a long silence, then another. The sound echoed through the valley, a slow, iron heartbeat for the town that had died. But there was no one in the belfry. There was no one to pull the rope. The sound was a final, supernatural punctuation mark on the morning's horror. For the blacksmith and the deputy, this was the final breaking point. Their minds, already strained to the point of shattering, could not process this last impossibility. They collapsed, their sanity fleeing from a world that no longer made any sense. Luther Pike, the guide, simply sat down on the edge of the town well, his face an unreadable mask of weary resignation, as if he had known all along that this was the only possible outcome. But for Sheriff Amos Weller, the tolling of the bell was a clarifying fire. In the face of this absolute, apocalyptic despair, something within him solidified. His fear was burned away, replaced by a cold, pure, and singular purpose. The law was dead, reason was a phantom, his town was gone. All that was left was the source. All that was left was the mountain, the witch, and the ledger. He knew then what he had to do. This was no longer an investigation. It was a confrontation. He could not save his people, but he could face the power that had taken them. He would not die a silent, empty shell in his own home. He would return to the mountain, not as a sheriff enforcing the laws of men, but as a man demanding an answer from a god. He turned his back on the silent town, on the tolling bell, on the weeping remnants of his search party. He did not say goodbye. There was no one left to say it to. He began to walk, alone, leaving the town that was already half dead behind him, his steps aimed directly at the high, fog-shrouded peaks. He was going to climb one last time, to find the cabin, and to stand before the witch and the lawman, and to see his own name on the final page of the ledger. The final ascent of Sheriff Amos Weller was an act not of courage, but of necessity. The world below had been hollowed out, its meaning and its people erased, leaving only the source of the affliction as a point of reality in a landscape of waking nightmare. He climbed with a purpose that was cold and sharp as a shard of glass. Fear was a luxury he could no longer afford. It had been cauterized by the absolute horror of what he had witnessed in the town. He was a man with nothing left to lose, and in that, he found a strange, terrible freedom. He carried no rifle. The weapons of man were a laughable foolishness against a power that could command the storms and steal the minds of an entire community. His only companions were the cold weight of his pistol, a tool of a law that no longer applied, and the impossible wooden charm in his pocket, a relic from a past that had never been. The mountain seemed to watch his approach, its silence now feeling less like an absence and more like a state of deep, patient contemplation. The dead zones, which had seemed so alien and terrifying on the first ascent, now felt familiar, like the antechambers to a throne room he was destined to enter. The fog, when it came, did not swirl with menacing whispers. It was a soft, gray, and reverent blanket, muffling the world and isolating him for his final audience. He walked the path from memory, his feet finding their way through the twilight of the twisted woods, as if he had been born to this pilgrimage. There was no disorientation, no psychological assault. The mountain had already shown him its power. This was not a trial. It was a summons. He reached the clearing and saw the cabin, a dark, primal shape in the center of the mist. It looked unchanged, an ancient, patient fixture in the landscape. There was no smoke from the chimney this time. The invitation was no longer needed. He was expected. He did not hesitate at the door. He pushed it open and stepped inside, his boots making no sound on the dusty floorboards. The interior was as he remembered it, a box of shadows and profound, sepulchral cold. The table stood in the center of the room, and upon it, the open ledger. But the room was no longer empty. She was there. In the far corner of the cabin, near the cold black hearth, a figure sat on a low stool, her back to him. She was small, frail, a collection of angles wrapped in layers of dark, ragged shawls. She appeared to be tending to something in her lap, her movements slow and deliberate, like a spider mending its web. For a long moment, she did not acknowledge his presence. The only sound was the faint, dry, rustling noise of her work. Sheriff Weller stood in the center of the room, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, a gesture that was both a threat and a prayer. Finally, without turning, she spoke. Her voice was not the monstrous, disembodied whisper from the fog. It was a voice of immense and weary age, dry and thin as autumn leaves, yet it filled the small cabin with an authority that was absolute. She said his name, Amos Weller, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, an entry being confirmed in a log. He found his own voice, and it was a stranger to him, a rough, broken thing. He asked her who she was. She paused in her work and, for the first time, turned her head slowly to look at him. Her face was a topography of wrinkles, a pale, bloodless mask from which two eyes stared out with a clarity and intelligence that was terrifying. They were not the wild, crazed eyes of a madwoman, but the calm, ancient, and utterly indifferent eyes of a predator or a god. She told him that her name did not matter. She was the will of the mountain, its memory, its balance. She was the hand that made the entry when a debt was incurred. She said she was the rule that the town had, for generations, understood and obeyed. Weller's grief, his rage, his terror, all coalesced into a single, burning question. He asked her why the town, why the children, the innocents, who had taken nothing. He gestured with his free hand, a sweep that encompassed the silent, dead community below. He said they had feared her, they had respected her law. The woman turned back to her work. She explained, in that same dry, passionless voice, that he did not understand. The taking, she said, was never a punishment. It was a restoration. It was balance. For every stone, for every feather, for every life taken from the mountain, something of equal value had to be returned. The traveler, she explained, had been an anomaly. He had taken without understanding, and in doing so, had broken a covenant that was older than the town, older than the trees. His theft had created a debt so profound it could not be paid by one soul alone. The balance had been catastrophically disturbed. And so, the mountain had simply collected what it was owed, repossessing the entire community that had sprung from its soil, drawing their spirits back into itself to restore the equilibrium. As she spoke, Weller moved closer. He could see now what she was tending to in her lap. She was carving. In her gnarled, ancient hands, she held a small piece of pale wood and a shard of obsidian, with which she was meticulously, exquisitely carving the likeness of a human face. It was the face of the young farmer who had vanished from the cabin during the storm. She was not just a guardian or a record keeper. She was the creator of the artifacts, the artisan of the curse. Weller looked past her, into the deep shadows of the cabin's corners, and in the gloom, he saw them. Shelves, dozens of them, reaching from the floor to the ceiling, all but invisible in the darkness, and upon the shelves were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of small, carved objects. A tiny wooden horse, a polished stone in the shape of a heart, a doll made of corn husks and human hair, a dried flower pressed between panes of mica. It was a vast, silent, and horrifying museum of every debt ever paid. It was the collected essence of every tragedy that had ever befallen the people of Gatlinburg. This, then, was the truth. She was not a witch who lived on the mountain. She was the mountain itself, its will given a frail, human form. She was the archivist of their sins, the arbiter of a law so ancient and so absolute that human morality had no meaning in its court. Weller felt the last of his world fall away. There was no good, no evil. There was only the mountain and the terrible, inexorable arithmetic of its balance. He had his answer. It was not an answer that brought peace or understanding, but it was an answer nonetheless. All that was left was the final, futile gesture of a man representing a dead and powerless authority. His hand tightened on his pistol. He drew the weapon. The sound of the hammer being cocked was a deafening crack in the silence. He raised the gun. Its black metal formed a stark and modern intrusion into the ancient, timeless room. He aimed it at the small, hunched figure. The woman did not flinch. She did not even look up from her carving. She simply spoke one last time. She told him that the lawman cannot enforce his rules upon the law. As she said the words, a faint scratching sound filled the cabin. It was the sound of a quill on dry paper. Weller's eyes darted from the woman to the open ledger on the table. And he watched, in the final, terrible moment of his comprehension, as his own name, Sheriff Amos Weller, wrote itself onto the ledger's final, waiting page. The script was elegant, black, and impossibly clear. A gust of wind, from nowhere, swept through the cabin, its touch as cold as the grave. It riffled the pages of the ledger, turning them back through the generations of the lost, until it reached the final, freshly written entry. And then, with a soft final sigh, the ledger closed itself. Years later, state surveyors and census takers would note the anomaly of the valley called Gatlinburg. They found a town perfectly preserved but utterly empty, its cabins slowly surrendering to the relentless embrace of the wilderness. Travelers who ventured too far up the trails of the Great Smoky Mountains would, on occasion, still vanish without a trace. And each time, though no one ever knew to make the connection, the state records would quietly and inexplicably register one fewer name in its official census. The mountain continued to keep its accounts, its ledger unseen, its balance meticulously and eternally maintained. The case file on the Gatlinburg witch is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened, and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.